You'll be sleeping in your car by Friday. My stepfather said it like he was reading a weather forecast, swirling his bourbon, not even looking up from his phone. My mother sat beside him in her cashmere robe and said nothing. The judge across the table from us, a family mediator named Helen, looked at me with something close to pity. Do you understand what your parents are proposing, Marguerite? I understood perfectly. I understood that the man holding my mother's hand had just spent 6 minutes explaining to a court-appointed mediator that I, a 31-year-old woman who worked the front desk at a regional credit union, was a burden they could no longer carry. My name is Marguerite Kessler. I'm 31 years old. And 11 days before that meeting, I had legally become the majority shareholder of the bank that held every single one of my stepfather's loans. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the dinner. It was a Sunday in late October, the kind of crisp Ohio evening where the leaves had just started turning, and my mother had invited me to the house in Pepper Pike for what she called a family check-in. I should have known something was coming the moment I saw the dining table set with the good china, the stuff we only used for my stepfather Russell's business clients. Russell Voss had married my mother 9 years earlier, 2 years after my father died, and from the very first dinner he ever sat through with us, he made it clear that I was an inconvenience he'd inherited along with the wedding ring. He ran a chain of car dealerships across 3 counties, 4 showrooms with his name in gold letters on the building, and he wore that success like a crown he'd polished himself. My mother, Dana, had spent the better part of a decade rewriting herself in his image, trading in her old Honda for a leased Range Rover, trading in her warmth for his coldness, one quiet concession at a time. My younger half-brother, Tobias, was there too, 28 years old, sitting at the table in a blazer that cost more than my monthly rent, scrolling through his phone with the bored expression of a man who had never once worried about where his next paycheck was coming from. Tobias worked, if you could call it that, as a regional partnerships associate at one of Russell's dealerships, a job that mostly involved taking long lunches and posting pictures of leased Porsches on social media. His wife, Priya, sat next to him twisting a sapphire bracelet around her wrist, the kind of woman who'd grown up comfortable and married into more comfortable still. For most of dinner, they did what they always did. Tobias complained about how slow the new showroom renovation was going, fishing for Russell to throw more money at the contractor. Priya talked about the kitchen remodel they wanted, dropping the words Carrara marble into the conversation like it was a magic incantation that would make Russell reach for his checkbook. I ate quietly at the far end of the table, the way I always did, invisible in the family I'd technically belonged to since I was 22 years old. They thought I was exactly what I appeared to be. A woman who answered phone calls about overdraft fees for $40,000 a year, living in a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner's, driving a 2014 Corolla with a check engine light that never went out. What they didn't know, what nobody at that table knew, was that the credit union job was a cover I'd built carefully over 3 years, a quiet front for the small but increasingly aggressive distressed debt firm I'd started in a co-working space in downtown Cleveland. I called it Ferrum Capital. I had spent those 3 years buying up bad loans nobody wanted, learning the wreckage of over-leveraged car dealerships from the inside, because I knew exactly which dealership chain in the region was drowning fastest. I'd been watching Russell's books indirectly for over a year. Then Russell cleared his throat the way he always did before delivering bad news disguised as wisdom, and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded document and slid it across the table. It landed near my plate, the corner soaking up a bit of gravy from the pot roast. Notice to vacate, 30 days. You've had a good run, Marguerite, he said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. But you're 31. You're living in a property I'm covering half the mortgage on. You're contributing nothing toward the family, and frankly, it's time you stood on your own 2 feet. He said this as though I had ever asked him for a single dollar, as though the apartment above the dry cleaners wasn't entirely mine. Paid for entirely by me, a fact he had simply never bothered to learn because he'd never once asked. Tobias snickered into his wineglass. Priya covered her mouth, eyes sparkling. You can't seriously be surprised, Tobias said. You answer phones for a living, Marguerite. At some point you have to get a real plan. He reached into his blazer and pulled out his wallet, peeled off a crisp $100 bill, and slid it across the table next to the eviction notice. Here, put it toward a U-Haul. Consider it a parting gift from someone who actually built something. My mother said nothing. She never did. She just sat there with her wine glass, looking at the tablecloth instead of at me. I looked at the notice. I looked at the $100 bill sitting next to it like a tip for a waitress who'd done a passable job, and then I did the one thing they never expected. I smiled. I picked up my fork, took a slow bite of pot roast, and chewed. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. They had wanted tears. They had wanted me to beg. "You're 3 payments behind on the Westlake showroom's floor plan financing," I said instead, my voice perfectly even, "which means the Sandusky expansion is dead before it ever broke ground." Russell's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "Excuse me, you haven't made a payment to your inventory lender since August. Your dealer floor plan is in default. The bank that's been quietly extending your grace period for the last 60 days is about 30 days from calling the whole note. That's why you need cash. That's why you suddenly remembered I exist and decided selling the apartment building made sense." I took a sip of water. I'm not wrong, am I? The color drained out of Russell's face so fast it was almost theatrical. Tobias stopped scrolling on his phone. Priya looked between the two of them, utterly lost. "How would you possibly?" Russell started, then stopped himself, because saying it out loud meant admitting it was true. I didn't answer. I just picked up my coat, thanked my mother for dinner with a politeness that I'm sure unsettled her more than anger ever could have, and walked out into the cold. In the parking lot, I called Devin, my chief financial analyst at Ferrum. "It's time," I said. "Pull every loan tied to Russell Voss and his dealership group. I want the floor plan debt on the Sandusky property, I want the operating line on the Westlake showroom, and I want to know who's holding the mortgage on the house in Pepper Pike." Devin didn't hesitate. "Give me 48 hours. It took him 36. The picture that came back was worse than even I expected. Russell wasn't just behind on his floor plan financing. He'd taken out a second commercial loan against the Pepper Pike house itself, using it as collateral to cover a shortfall after a lawsuit from a former customer over a rolled-back odometer, a lawsuit he'd settled quietly and never told my mother about. The loan had been routed through a regional lender, Lakeshore Commercial Bank, a small bank that had been struggling for 2 years and had recently been put up for a quiet off-market acquisition by a larger holding group. That holding group was negotiating with 3 potential buyers. I made sure Ferrum Capital became the 4th, and the only one willing to close in 9 days instead of 90. While the acquisition moved through closing, I kept showing up to work at the credit union, badge clipped to my blazer, answering calls about overdraft fees, because the last thing I wanted is for Russell to suspect anything before the ink was dry. 3 days after the dinner, Tobias texted me a video. 10 seconds long. It was Priya's voice behind the camera, giggling, panning across my old childhood bedroom where I still kept a box of winter clothes. Russell stood in the doorway, ripping my coat off its hanger and threw it out the second-floor window into the slush below. "Looks like the freeloader forgot her things," he said to the camera, grinning. Tobias followed with an armful of my sweaters, hurling them out after the coat. The video ended on Priya's face. "Enjoy the shelter, loser." I watched it once. I felt nothing close to the panic they were hoping for. I felt the cold, clean calm of a woman watching the last excuse for mercy evaporate. "Push the closing up," I told Devin. "I want it done by Monday." 2 weeks after the dinner, Russell received a hand-delivered letter informing him that Lakeshore Commercial Bank, the institution holding both his floor plan financing and the second mortgage on his house, had been acquired. He had no idea by whom. Banks change hands quietly all the time, and Russell, arrogant as he was, never thought to ask who'd be reviewing his loan file going forward. He found out at the mediation hearing he himself had requested, the one meant to formalize my eviction from a property I'd never lived in for free a day in my life, the one where Helen, the mediator, sat across the table trying to gently coax me into accepting an arrangement that gave Russell full control of my late father's small remaining trust fund for safekeeping, in exchange for my quiet, dignified exit from the family. "Marguerite," Russell said, leaning forward with that practiced concern he used on customers right before he upsold them an extended warranty they didn't need, "this isn't personal. I'm trying to help you build independence. You'll thank me one day. You'll be sleeping in your car by Friday," he'd said earlier, when Helen first asked him to summarize his position. I'd let that sentence sit in the room for almost a full minute before I spoke. "Before we sign anything," I said, sliding a single folder across the table, "I think you should look at this." Russell opened it without much interest, the way you'd glance at a parking ticket you assumed was somebody else's mistake. I watched his eyes move across the first page. I watched them stop. I watched the blood leave his face exactly the way it had at dinner 3 weeks earlier, except this time there was no recovering it with a sip of wine. "What is this?" he said, his voice flat. "That's the notice of assignment for your floor plan financing and your second mortgage. Lakeshore Commercial Bank was acquired 11 days ago. I'm the majority shareholder, which means as of right now, I'm your lender, Russell. Not your stepdaughter you can hand a $100 bill and an eviction notice. Your lender." Helen, the mediator, set down her pen very slowly. Russell's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. "This is fabricated. This is some kind of trick. Call the bank's main line," I said. "Ask for the new ownership structure. They'll confirm it in about 90 seconds. He didn't call. He didn't need to. The terror on his face told me he already believed every word. "You're 3 payments behind on the floor plan note," I continued, my voice the same calm conversational tone I'd used over pot roast. "You're also 6 weeks past due on the second mortgage you took out against the Pepper Pike house without my mother's knowledge, to settle a lawsuit you never told her about, over an odometer rollback scheme at the Westlake location that you personally signed off on." "That's not," Russell started. "I have the wire transfers, Russell. I have the settlement agreement. I have the names of the 3 customers your sales managers coached to misrepresent mileage on certified pre-owned vehicles. As of this morning, my legal team has also referred that file to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, because selling odometer-rolled cars to retirees is a felony in the state of Ohio, and I don't particularly feel like protecting you from the consequences of that anymore." Helen looked up sharply. "Mr. Voss, is this true?" Russell didn't answer her. He was staring at me like he was actually seeing me, for the first time in 9 years. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't, because Tobias couldn't help himself. He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor, his face flushed with the particular outrage of a man who has never once been told no. "This is insane," he said. "You expect us to believe you? What, secretly own a bank? You answer phones at a credit union. You drive a Corolla with a check engine light that's been on since I've known you." "I do," I said. "And it's been a very useful disguise for the last 3 years, while I built Ferrum Capital from a co-working desk into a firm that currently manages $41 million in distressed commercial debt across 4 states. I never needed any of you to know that. I needed you to keep underestimating me, because every single time you did, you handed me information you should have kept private." Tobias's mouth twisted into something ugly. "You think this changes anything? You're still the family disappointment. You think buying a tiny regional bank makes you some kind of mogul? You're pathetic, and you always will be." "Sit down, Tobias," I said quietly. "Before I tell Priya about the dealership's marketing budget you've been quietly siphoning into your personal trading account for the last 14 months. I have the wire records. I have the timestamps. Your father isn't the only Voss with a creative relationship to other people's money." Priya's head snapped toward her husband so fast her bracelet jingled. "What is she talking about, Tobias?" "She's lying," he said, but his voice cracked on the second word, and Priya, who had grown up the daughter of an accountant and knew exactly what a guilty silence sounded like, did not look reassured. My mother had not said a single word this entire time. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the table, the same way she'd stared at the tablecloth 3 weeks earlier, while Russell handed me an eviction notice over pot roast. I looked at her, and for one moment something in me wanted her to say something, anything, to push back, to remember that I was her daughter before I was Russell's inconvenience. "Mom," I said, "did you know about the second mortgage on the house? Did you know he forged your signature on the loan documents to use the Pepper Pike property as collateral?" Her head came up slowly. "What?" I slid a second folder across the table, this one toward her. She opened it with trembling hands. I watched her find the signature page, the one with her name on the loan guarantee, the one she had absolutely never signed. "That's not my signature," she whispered. "I never signed this. Russell told me the refinance paperwork from 2 years ago was just standard renewal forms." Russell's jaw tightened. "Dana, sweetheart, let's discuss this at home. You forged my name on a loan," my mother said, and her voice was rising now, shaking loose 9 years of careful, practiced silence. "You put our house up as collateral and you forged my name." "I was protecting the family," Russell snapped, "the same line men like him always reach for. I was handling things so you wouldn't have to worry." "You were committing fraud, Russell," I said. "Against your wife, the same way you tried to commit it against the customers buying cars from your lot." The state attorney general's office is going to find that very interesting, given everything else in that file. The mediation room had gone completely silent except for the sound of Priya quietly gathering her purse, sliding her chair back, eyeing the door like a woman calculating exactly how fast she could leave this marriage before it took her down with it. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer, the cheap one from the credit union job, the one I'd worn on purpose, because I wanted Russell to remember exactly what I looked like when I dismantled him. I wasn't wearing a power suit. I was wearing the same gray blazer I'd worn answering phones for 3 years while quietly building the thing that would end him. "I'm not signing the agreement," I said. "I'm not surrendering my father's trust." And as of this morning, Ferrum Capital, through Lakeshore Commercial Bank, is calling in the floor plan note in full. You have 10 days to bring the account current or the bank exercises its right to seize the dealership inventory as collateral. Given that you're also 6 weeks behind on the second mortgage, I'd start packing, Russell. 28 days from today, the house in Pepper Pike goes into foreclosure proceedings unless that note is also brought current, which, given what you just told an attorney general's investigator is now reviewing, seems unlikely. "You can't do this," Russell said, finally finishing his again, though it came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I'm your stepfather. I gave you a roof over your head for years." "You gave my mother a roof," I said, "and you spent 9 years reminding me I didn't belong under it. You don't get credit for charity you never actually extended." I left the mediation office and didn't look back. My mother followed me out into the hallway a few minutes later, her face pale, her hands still shaking slightly around the strap of her purse. "Marguerite," she said, "I had no idea about any of it. The lawsuit, the loan, the cars." "I know," I said, and I meant it. My mother's failure had never been malice. It had been the quiet, exhausting cowardice of a woman who'd rather not look too closely at the man paying her bills. "You have a choice now, Mom. You can keep not looking. Or you can finally see what's actually in front of you." She didn't answer right away. But 3 days later she called me, and for the first time in 9 years she didn't sound like Russell's wife. She sounded like my mother. The foreclosure on the Pepper Pike house went through 40 days later, after Russell failed to bring either note current, after the dealership's floor plan inventory was seized and liquidated to satisfy the defaulted debt, after the state attorney general's office filed formal charges related to the odometer fraud, charges that would eventually end with Russell pleading guilty to avoid a longer sentence and accepting 18 months in a state correctional facility, along with a permanent ban from selling vehicles in Ohio. Tobias, stripped of the dealership job that had never required him to do much of anything, found himself unable to explain the missing marketing funds to Priya's father, who happened to be the accountant who eventually reviewed their joint finances during the divorce that followed 3 months later. He moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Lakewood that, by his own bitter admission to a mutual cousin, was smaller than the apartment above the dry cleaners he used to mock me for living in. My mother moved into a small condo near the lake, the first home that had ever belonged entirely to her, paid for with the settlement she received from Russell's estate during the divorce, the one I made sure her lawyer fought hard for. 6 months after that dinner, I stood in the renovated lobby of what used to be Lakeshore Commercial Bank's flagship branch, now reopened under Ferrum Capital's name, hosting the first annual scholarship gala for women rebuilding their finances after leaving controlling or abusive households. My mother sat in the front row, sober and steady, wearing a navy dress she'd picked out herself instead of one Russell had chosen for her. I thought about the woman who used to answer phones in a gray blazer, who used to eat dinner in silence at the far end of a table that was never really hers, who used to let people hand her $100 bills like an apology for taking up space in her own family. I don't carry that woman's silence anymore. I carry her patience, though, because patience was never weakness. It was the long, quiet work of building something nobody could take away from me, brick by brick, loan by loan, until the people who'd spent a decade telling me I didn't belong at the table finally understood that I had never needed their permission to own it.